Good morning. Time now, few minutes after 8 a.m. In Tokyo, October 21st, Friday. Welcome to another edition of the online morning seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. In our morning seminar programs, we are trying to feature the latest report and analytical works put together by the World Bank. And then having the authors of those reports, they are the World Bank's economists and experts, to present the main point of the report to the audience in Japan in this format. This morning, we have a pleasure of having Amir Ahmed, who is the senior economist for South Asia in the social protection and the job global practice, connecting us from Washington. Good evening, good morning, Amir. How are you? Can you hear me?
Good evening, Koichi. Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing very well, and thank you for welcoming me to the Tokyo Morning Seminar Series. Very happy to be here.
Great. Thank you very much. We are featuring the new report, Toward Safer and More Productive Migration for South Asia, which was released in May this year. And then next 40 minutes, we are going to listen to Amir presenting the main point of this new report on migration. And then after his presentation, as usual, I'll read a question that we received from the audience. If you did not have an opportunity to send your question in advance, please send your question through the online format, which is posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section on the YouTube screen. I'll read your question after Amir's presentation and ask him to respond to your question. With that, I would like to ask Amir to come in to start your presentation. Amir, over to you.
Great, thank you once again. So as my colleague mentioned, for the next 30 minutes, I'll be discussing some work that my department, Social Protection and Jobs, conducted in, I would say, the work starting in the years before the pandemic and continuing through. And it's on international economic migration. The work was led by myself and by my colleague Laurent Bossavi, and included a very broad team of economists and other experts throughout the South Asia region. And so even though I'm presenting and the report has mine and Laurent's name on it, it was a big team that put a lot of effort into this work. So just by way of introduction, as many of you may know, South Asia is a region with a very high population, almost 2 billion people, many of whom are young and in the working age. And for the next coming decades, this working age population is expected to grow, given where the region and many of the countries are in the demographic transition process. What this basically means is that there's intense pressure to create jobs for many of these young people entering the labor force and many of the people in the working age population. And on average, South Asian economies have done very well in creating jobs to absorb the increasingly skilled labor supply. But by and large, the private sector, in some cases, has not necessarily been able to keep up with the pace of growth of the labor supply. And that's where temporary economic migration has come in a big way to create a safety valve for the labor market in a way that is beneficial to the economies and also to other economies where the workers are going. So the way I'm structuring this discussion, I'll walk through three sets of issues. The first is on why temporary economic migration is relevant for the region, some of the key challenges and constraints to making migration safer, more productive, more beneficial for development, and then finally focusing on some of the key issues that we need to think about to make it even more safer and even more productive and more beneficial. So starting with the first block of issues, and many of you may already be familiar with this, but I think it's good for us to get on the same page. So first off, why is temporary economic migration even relevant for South Asia? And I use the word temporary economic migration intentionally because As we know, migration can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It can mean permanent movement from one country to another. It could mean forcible displacement, refugee movements. But in the context of this report, and it's quite important for the South Asia region, is this concept of temporary economic migration, whereby workers can leave from the country voluntarily through formal, regular channels to go and work somewhere else for a few years and then return to the same formal, regular channels. For those of you that might be familiar with international trade mechanisms, if we think of trade and services, under the General Agreement of Trade and Services, one of the modes of service trade is temporary movement of natural persons, mode 4 movements. And that's really the type of migration that we're talking about. Now, when we think about temporary economic migration from South Asia, it is incredibly substantial. So here we're looking at two charts, one that talks about the stock of migrants by country, and we see that by any measure, it's in the tens of millions of South Asians that live in other countries, and that over time these numbers have grown. And so, because of the time that we started wrapping up this report, the data only goes up to 2017, and certainly the pandemic has had an impact on migration patterns. But structurally, what we'd seen in the decades leading up to the pandemic, the stock of migrants from South Asia had just been on track to grow and grow steadily. That's on the left-hand side, the stock of migrants, the number of people living in a different country, but whose origins are from one of these South Asian countries. That's like the stock. And then when you think about the flow, is like the number of people receiving clearances or permission to leave their home country to go and work on a temporary basis in another country. Those flows are also quite substantial. So in many cases, they've also grown over time. For example, if we just look at the flow for Bangladesh, in the years leading up to the pandemic, it was in the order of 500,000 or more migrants leaving for temporary employment overseas. Now, given these large flows, the impacts on the sending countries and the home economies is quite large. Let's start with the macroeconomic impact. So migrant workers, when they go overseas, especially from South Asia, and because it's temporary movement, they usually have a relatively high rate of remittance. That is, sending back a portion of the income that they're earning back to the home economy. Now, when we think about these remittance flows as relative to the size of the sending country, of the sending country's GDP in this particular case, these flows are tremendously important. They can go anywhere between 6 to 8% for the region on average, but there is variation. So, for example, for a country like Afghanistan that traditionally has not sent many workers overseas through formal, regular channels for temporary economic migration, remittances are relatively small. But for a country like Nepal, prior to the pandemic, remittances were equivalent to about almost a quarter or more of GDP. That's in relative flows. And if we look at it in terms of absolute flows, it's still quite substantial. So here we're comparing remittance flows in millions of US dollars to the revenue generated from exports, FDI, and overseas development assistance. And in a country like Nepal, for example, it's higher than any other inflow into the country. In the case of a country like Pakistan or Bangladesh, remittance flows are higher than FDI, higher than ODA, and comparable to what's coming from export revenue. So going back to this idea of thinking of temporary economic migration as a trade and service, it's a major source of export revenue, and if you want to think of it in trade terms. So that's at the macroeconomic level. And what does it mean at the household level? Because migrants are people; they're coming from a particular household. Beyond the macro level, remittances have been critically important for the development narrative of those that have remained behind. So one beneficiary of temporary economic migration from South Asia has been the migrant themselves. They go overseas and they quadruple, pentuple their incomes in many cases. But it's also their households. So here we're looking at the migrants' income for many different corridors. So between starting with within Asia, from South Asia to other economies. And we see that as a ratio of their pre and post post to pre-migration wages, it's typically on the order of quadrupling their wages. So it's a tremendous improvement in their productivity and in their earnings. And as I mentioned, it's also a benefit to their households, because given the relatively high rate of remittance of South Asian migrants, typically, the main beneficiary, one of the main beneficiaries after themselves, is the households that they leave behind. Because of the legal structure by which many of these migrants go overseas, whether it's to the Gulf Cooperation Council economies or to Korea or to Malaysia, they typically can't take their families with them. So their spouses, their parents, their children remain behind in the home country, while the migrant workers spends 3, 7, 8 years, however many years overseas, perhaps in different chunks. And the remittance that goes back to the household and supports consumption. It supports investments in education, in health, and generally helps uplift the household's welfare. So these are some figures from Bangladesh just to illustrate. So if we use the household income expenditure survey for Bangladesh, and we separated out households that were below the poverty line and above the poverty line for migrant sending households, if we took away 2/3 of remittance income from that household, we would see about 40% of households would fall back, would fall below the poverty line. All right. So if you just look at the pie as a whole, more than half of migrant sending households are not poor. I would say about 93% of households are above the poverty line. But once you take away that remittance income and give them the income that they had prior to departure, or if we assume that the similar income to what they would have had they never left, then we see that another 41% of those particular households would have fallen into poverty. And once again, here we see some of the differences in their wages prior to, before and after migration. So now, if we appreciate the magnitude of the impact that international migration can have at the macroeconomic level, at the individual level, and at the household level for South Asians and South Asian economies, we start thinking about what are the constraints that prevent migration, temporary economic migration, from becoming more beneficial for development. And there's a lot been written about different challenges, different issues, social issues, economic issues. I'll try to focus on 3 of the big ticket challenges to getting more out of international migration. Now, the first set of issues it has to do around access. So if we think about the costs of migrating, there are many costs. What worker has to find a job, has to know about those opportunities, has to get on a plane, has to go and navigate the various labor market regulations, recruitment processes. And so when we think about the costs of migration for South Asians, what we end up seeing relative to other migrants from other Asian economies or other high migrant sending economies, we see that typically South Asians tend to face substantially higher costs than their peers from, let's say, East Asia. So here we look at some figures from the Nomad Cost of Migration surveys for several different corridors. And what we see is that for migrants from Pakistan, from Nepal, in Bangladesh, we have separate data. We see that typically what they end up paying is just in order to migrate to their destination is in the order of half a year or more of their wages at destination. All right. And as I mentioned, it's very similar for Bangladeshi migrants. If we look at the cost of migrating from Bangladesh for one of these temporary economic migrants to some of the major destinations in the Gulf Cooperation Council economies or to Malaysia, we see that it's typically 6 months to almost a year worth of their wages at destination. And when we try to sort of understand the breakdown of these costs, what we end up seeing is that typically a good proportion of these are what we'll call intermediary fees, because the cost of labor market intermediation from one country in South Asia to another country in their destination tends to be extremely high. And I'll come back to some exceptions at the very end. But typically, if we think about some of these destinations, like in the Gulf Cooperation Council economies, the costs are high because there's typically imperfect information. Migrants in Bangladesh come from a wide variety of areas within the country. They don't know about the opportunities. They don't know about the government processes that are in place to sort of protect them on the way out. They don't know their rights. They don't necessarily know how much the cost of travel is, and so on and so forth. And so that's where in South Asia there's a vibrant private sector around providing these recruitment services. They're called different things in different countries. In some places they're called manpower agencies, recruitment agencies, intermediaries. And so typically, because of the market around this, in the case of Bangladesh at least, the intermediary fees for these destinations from this innovative survey that we fielded for this report, intermediary fees come out to about almost 50 to 60% of the cost of migration. And when I mentioned that there were exceptions to this, there are exceptions when we have some high functioning government to government programs. For example, the Korea EPS program, Economic Permit System, I believe is what the acronym stands for, which is a program managed by the government of Korea to recruit directly from countries that are part of the program. And so in some programs like these government to government programs, where it's a public program with a certain level of quality control and requirements, the private sector, first of all, the profile of migrants is different, but also the structure of the market is different. So the intermediary fees almost disappears, although there might be other fees. So moving on, this is also to sort of illustrate the same point about like the high costs of migration beyond just the airfare. As I mentioned, if we look at things like and the general lack of information on average for many migrants from South Asia, these transactions costs tend to add up. Now, one might say that, well, these high costs just reflect the demand for migrants, and that's true. These jobs are in overseas markets are generally, as you saw, they can triple, quadruple the incomes of migrants, and so one could say that, well, it's just supply and demand in play. Well, and we've seen that then perhaps there's some other things going on there, but an implication of this is that one is access. So in order to finance this, one must be able to either have resources of their own. So the poorest workers in countries may not be able to access international opportunities, or if they have some resources, they might need to use collateral to finance it, or incur debt. And as we see here, migrants tend to accumulate a lot. Substantial numbers of migrants have to accumulate some debt in order to finance their migration experience. And what this ends up doing is, in some cases, it can lead to over-indebtedness because of the combination of the high costs and the debt and the time it takes to pay off their debt. They're unable to necessarily move or leave an employment opportunity that might not be a good fit or that's unsafe, and so on. And so it increases the risk of over-indebtedness and increases the risk of exposure to exploitation, abuse, or other circumstances where maybe their safety is compromised at their destination. A second challenge, and so we're sort of getting into sort of the more structural macroeconomic issues, this has to do with the pattern of economic migration. If we once again, if we sort of think about temporary economic migration as a trading service, and you think of the export destinations, it's always better to have a diverse set of markets, right? Because if one country experiences, one destination experiences a shock, or one market experiences a shock, and then the overall impact on the descending country is smaller. But what we end up seeing in South Asia is that there's typically a very high concentration of markets, and primarily to Gulf Cooperation Councils, and this has to do with the profile of workers that South Asia typically sends. Traditionally, South Asian workers have been more in the lower skill intensive sectors like construction, hospitality, tourism management, retail, in the service sector. Although more recently, some states like Kerala in India have been sending more skilled workers like doctors, nurses, and or Sri Lanka that's been sending out skilled caregivers to different economies. But if we think about the mass of migrant workers from South Asia, they typically tend to be lower skilled, and the largest markets for these types of workers is the GCC economies, and to a lesser extent Malaysia. Now, and we can an implication of this though is that if there's a shock of some sort, whether it's a policy shock or a change in the policy of the migrant receiving country, then that can have a huge impact on flows. So just to illustrate, and once again from the case of Bangladesh, we see about 60% of migrant workers from Bangladesh are in Saudi Arabia as of 2017. But what happened? But prior to that, there were many. The share of workers in the United Arab Emirates was much higher. And what happened around 2012? There was a change in policy in terms of where migrant workers could be sourced from in the Arab Emirates, and that led to a crash in the number of outbound migrants from Bangladesh to the United Arab Emirates. Around the same time, we saw the opposite happen. In around 2015, 2016, Saudi Arabia signed an MOU with the government of Bangladesh for a certain number of temporary economic migrants, and that led to a massive spike in the number of outbound migrants in the following years, leading to this pattern of migrants that we see on the left hand in the pie chart. So very, very sensitive to the flows, especially if it's concentrated. And then we think about things like labor market policies, and this is just what I said. But if you think about the interaction of policies in one country having an impact on others, we saw that in the case of Bangladesh that there was a massive increase in the number of migrants, but the opposite can happen too. So in this case, we see India with a typically had been 300,000 workers annually to Saudi Arabia. We see around 2015 when they instituted minimum wage and other regulations in the requirements for workers from India going to Saudi Arabia. We saw that it led to a decline in the workers going forward. So policy shocks can add to the volatility, even if those shocks are coming from third countries. In this case, sort of the interaction between policy developments in Bangladesh versus India vis-a-vis Saudi market. A third challenge has to do with its structural. So we've sort of had the challenges at the access migration and access to labor opportunity, to job opportunities in overseas migrants, and how it can exacerbate exposure to different risks. We saw sort of the volatility that can happen due to a shock. And the most recent shocks, of course, have been the pandemic, where many countries instituted pandemic control related measures, which we saw, and then we saw substantial drops in flows, in some cases going to zero. Excuse me. But even prior the pandemic and independent of this volatility, what it, in some cases is a structural risk of structural flows. A structural risk to flows. So on the left, you see how for some countries like Bangladesh and decreases in others, but on average, for many countries in the region, we've seen a slowdown in the flows over time. And even in the case of an economy like Bangladesh, that did see an increase in flows, the increase is relatively small. So if when we think of a development model that relies heavily on international remittances and the labor market that has benefited tremendously national amount, these slowdowns in labor demand can be worrisome, especially in terms of remittance flows. So here we did some simulation analysis to sort of think about some of the different scenarios that could happen as different structural developments happen. You know, going from changes in labor market policies in GCC economies, for example, labor market nationalization, whereby the demand for certain types of workers would be lower, versus, let's say, aging in East Asian economies where the demand for workers like skilled caregivers might be increasing. And we tried to sort of quantify the impact on remittance growth. And so we constructed several different scenarios. The first was sort of the business as usual scenario, where if migration flow sort of grew at the same rate, historical rate between 2017 and 2027, then there'd be an increase in remittances in the order of about 2.122 billion. Now, if we believe that there's going to be a structural change that's detrimental to migration flow, let's say labor market nationalization in Gulf economies, or that labor market growth in East Asian economies is, migrant labor demand growth is in East Asian economies is historical, go at the historical pattern, and then there could be a substantial decline in remittance growth in the order of 32 billion. Then we started looking at combinations, different things like, well, what if there was a reversion to 2010 levels of migrant stocks in different countries, but then combined with, let's say, historically high growth in by historically high growth in East Asian markets. I mean, in the recent past, in the 2010, 2017 period, then the impact, then the negative impact on remittance flows is a bit smaller, which makes sense because even though there's relatively, there's been growth from South Asia to East Asian labor markets, they're starting from a relatively small base, and even the high growth is relatively small. And so then we sort of looked at one other scenario where, okay, there was a reversion in Gulf economy, Gulf Cooperation Council economies to 2010 levels of migration, but that the growth in labor demand for migrant workers from South Asia was in the order of 5 to 10 times what it's been historically, then remittance growth can actually continue, remittances can actually continue to grow substantially over time. And I should mention these are extremely stylized scenarios that have been disrupted by the pandemic. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you can still see me.
Yeah, actually, we are not seeing you, but we are hearing you. So please continue.
Okay, great.
Presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think I'm back now. Let me turn my video off in case that helps. All right. So and so I should mention here that these are stylized scenarios, and they're just meant to be illustrative because at the end of the day, sort of predicting how economies will change from one year to another is challenging. Trying to understand sort of the different drivers of labor demand in multiple economies and destination markets is also challenging. And of course, we can't account for idiosyncratic events like we're experiencing now. The conflict in Ukraine, inflation, oil price shocks, the pandemic that happened. All of these together impact the labor demand in destination markets, which can have a tremendous impact on flow. And so these are meant to be very illustrative scenarios that just sort of demonstrate the thinking that many of our counterparts in government in South Asia are thinking about, like the importance of diversifying the destinations and being able to take the steps necessary to be able to diversify, whether it's through writing new agreements with different economies, bilateral labor agreements, MOUs, or investing in their skills and skills development to be able to be more marketable in these other countries. I'm not sure if I'm able to advance the slides since it's frozen. But maybe I can move on to sort of the policy recommendations if everybody has had a chance to sort of see the slide separately.
Amel, let me come in and
essentially
share.
there are three.
I think at this moment we are about to lose him from the connection, but let me share his presentation from my end, and then to get ready for him to come back. Hold on. Okay. Once again, currently we are just losing Ahmed from the connection. We are waiting Ahmed to come back. So please wait for a moment. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm back and reconnected.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Ahmed. Yes, we can hear you now, and then I'm showing your presentation from my side.
Okay, so thank you very much. That might be helpful, and I'll.
Yeah, please. And so please let me know when I need to advance the slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So so before we start thinking about how to frame the issues, so one of an important insight that we need to keep in mind is that migration isn't a one-time event, and it's a process. There are activities that have to happen prior to migration, whether it's investments in skills, investments in financial, accumulating financial assets to be able to finance migration. On the government level, being able to have appropriate legal and institutional mechanisms for sending the migrants while migrants are at their destination, to sort of see how long they're there, what they're doing in terms of their incomes and their savings, And then after they return, what are they doing after they return? So their socioeconomic integration and whether they remain in their country or return. So really, when we think about sort of the issues around migration to make migration safer and more productive, we sort of have to take this life cycle approach. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the way that we sort of thought about this agenda is really along this life cycle, basically anchoring the agenda and different policies and program issues around three big pillars. The first is around safe migration. As I mentioned, so South Asian migrants could potentially be exposed to all kinds of risks when they migrate, whether it's and some of it could be physical exploitation, financial exploitation, or worse in the case of some female migrants. And so when you think about issues around safe migration, one key issue is just reducing the costs. So this could be through interventions on the regulatory side for recruitment agencies. It could be in the development of bilateral labor agreements or G2G, government to government mechanisms, where it might be more intensive and might leave out the private sector, but in some cases the costs can be kept lower. Another mechanism could be to remove information asymmetries so that aspiring migrants from sending economies know about opportunities in other countries, they know about the legal processes by which they can find information and go overseas. Receiving counseling from this is typical of employment, a typical employment service for domestic for workers in the domestic economy in many places, but applying it to international migrant workers. And then also the issue of insurance coverage, just making sure that workers are protected when they go overseas, whether it's in terms of health insurance or life insurance. Now, in order to make migration more productive, there are and beneficial to the sending country. Once again, there are things that can be done. One is this issue of intermediation, and this is related to the issue around managing the cost of migration, but it's slightly different. It's making sure that workers that are going overseas or that want to go overseas are able to find the right type of jobs, rather than being overskilled or underskilled for the types of employments that they actually go to, because both extremes can lead to job mismatches and either a waste of their investment prior to migration, or being unable to actually remain in their employment because of the mismatch. The second has to do with this point I mentioned earlier, this issue of investing in their skills, investing in themselves. And when I talk about investing in their skills, it's not necessarily just technical skills or general education, but it's also things like language. I mentioned the Korea program, the Korea EPS program. Investing in the Korean language is a major investment for migrants that go to Gulf Cooperation Council economies. Investing in Arabic to be able to interact with employers is incredibly important. Even in the case of Japan, there are trainees and workers that go to Japan, and investing in the Japanese language is probably one of the as important, if not more important, than investing in technical skills. And then the third point around making migration more productive is this issue of market diversification. Given the risks, the global risks that the many destination economies face, as I mentioned, macroeconomic shocks, climate shocks, changes in civil conflict, having a diversified set of countries that migrant workers can go to can help reduce a lot of the risks that can come to both migrants as well as the migrant sending countries. The third set of issues that we want to talk about in this agenda is the issue of return migration. So when migrants come back, they can come back with a lot more experience, more skills, and maybe more financial assets. But what do they do after they've returned? They're not necessarily coming back when they're of retirement age, but they might come back and still want to have a productive economic life. And so how do governments make the best use of these more productive, higher, more capitalized returnees? And in some cases, it might be just purely economic reintegration, but it could also be social reintegration. For example, for female migrant workers that go overseas for many years, or even male migrant workers, they go overseas for many years, they're away from their families, they're away from their communities. Helping them reintegrate into their communities is incredibly important for themselves, and also for reducing the social costs of migration. So we spend a lot of time talking about the financial costs earlier, but there's also a social cost that's borne by not just the migrant, but by the migrant's family, their children, and their wider communities. And in recent years, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, return migration has actually been incredibly important for many of our countries in South Asia because of increased flows of returnees and contract non-renewals. And I think after the first year or two, flows resumed in some cases, maybe not as high as before, but dealing with this influx of returnees that were coming back because of various reasons sort of required a policy response from many countries, as in the case of Bangladesh. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so keeping in mind these different pillars in the agenda and the fact that we have sort of there's a life cycle around migration, where we end up sort of what we would suggest beyond interventions, specific interventions in each of those three pillars, it might be helpful to sort of take a comprehensive systems approach from the government side to address migration issues. So here, if we think about sort of the four stages of the migration life cycle, pre-decision, before a migrant even decides to leave and they're sort of looking for a job, pre-departure, when they're out looking for a job, or maybe they've secured a job and they're preparing themselves to depart, during migration, when they're at the destination, after migration. Each of these comes with different sets of issues. Pre-decision phase is about understanding what are the costs of migration, how does one go about doing it, what are the benefits. Before they leave, it's preparing themselves, language training, legal training, legal counseling, understanding their rights, technical training to make themselves more employable. At their destination, understanding good use of financial literacy. How do they remit? How do they remit in a legal way? How to best use their resources while they're overseas and through investments, or what are their rights and protections of their destination. And of course, I just mentioned sort of the post-migration issues of socioeconomic reintegration. And in South Asia, we have the benefit of many of our good counterpart governments having institutions, whether ministries or agencies within labor ministries, that are dedicated purely to supporting migration and making it more safe, more productive. And through all of these, taking this life cycle approach is implicit, but perhaps it needs to be made explicit in some cases in order to be able to provide better services throughout this process. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. And I'm happy to take questions. And my apologies for that weird technical issue there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ame, for sharing the main findings of the report. Really appreciate it. Let me start with the question that we received during the presentation from Professor Shimamoto. I think this is a clarification question, so let me show the relevant page. When you the question is this: does intermediary cost includes the cost of the transportation? And I'm showing the slide of the intermediation cost discussion. So would you please clarify if transportation cost is included or not? Thank you.
So intermediary costs includes like fees being paid to, let's say, a recruitment agency or an agent that helps the migrant worker find a job. So for example, and like I said, they're called different things in different countries. In some places, they're called manpower agents or just agents. It's an individual. It could be an individual. It could be a company that basically has that's based in like the capital, like in Dhaka or in Kathmandu, that knows where the jobs are being advertised, and who then are able to, using their networks within the country, are able to go out to different smaller towns or villages and share information about this. And then that's how in some cases many aspiring migrants learn about these opportunities because of information asymmetries. Maybe they don't have access to that kind of information because of education or infrastructure and whatnot. And so really it's like intermediary cost refers to these recruitment agencies or these middlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your clarification. Let me read the question that we received in advance. The first one, how did you put into calculation the cost of migration apart from financial one, especially various aspects of negative impact to the left family members? That's one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we don't in our empirical analysis we don't actually count that, and it can be quite substantial in some cases, but it's very difficult. So there are two. Maybe there are two reasons why, two perspectives on this in the report. One is that it's difficult to quantify and capture through surveys because I think to sort of understand that, I mean, our colleagues in UN agencies and other research institutions have spent a lot of time on this, and it's very specific to the community because there's a heterogeneity on the social cost to the left behind families as well. And then there's a cost, but there are also benefits. So for example, left behind families, they might not have the benefit of, let's say, children in the household might not have the benefit of both parents, but their household income quadruples. And it's one thing if we're talking about a migrant sending household in, let's say, an urban area where there isn't an extended family network, versus in a rural area, in many cases, where it's not necessarily just the two parents and their children, but the two parents, their children, their aunts, uncles, grandparents, where there's this extended care network. So the cost varies. It also depends on the social cost. Also depends on who is migrating, and typically I think the social cost is higher for women if the woman is the migrant, because sometimes, and unfortunately in many cases, there is, even though the female migrant might be making a very high financial contribution to the household through the remittance process, because of social norms around female labor force participation, female labor force participation in a foreign country, there could be some social stigma and taboo around that, which can come back to them when they return. And because it's a very wide area, we don't even try to address it. We mention it in different places, but in the report itself, we don't spend too much time talking about the social costs of migration.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another question from the same anonymous person. What are your thoughts on the risk of relying on immigrants for economic development in host countries and country of origin, given the fact that the migration has various elements, motivations, and reasons, and there are forced migrations also? So if you have any comments to this question, thank you.
So that's a good question. So first off, here in this report, we're talking about regular, formal, temporary economic migration. So in the World Bank, we typically separate economic migration from forced displacement. Forced displacement is it's illegal. Nobody should be forcing anybody to migrate anywhere through international convention. Temporary economic migration is governed by various international agreements, and I mentioned, for example, the WTO's General Agreement of Trade and Services. Different countries establish, whether multilaterally or bilaterally, legal mechanisms for workers to go from one country to another, and that's really what we're talking about. And in those cases, it's a conscious decision of both parties or the group of countries to be able to take advantage of the natural resources and the market forces within each other's economies. So if we think about, let's say, the Gulf Cooperation Council economies, they have substantial natural resources, extractive industries, and they need workers to be able to support the services sector, and so on. Whereas South Asia has an abundance of labor that's increasingly becoming more skilled. So it's a win-win in some of these cases, in many of these cases, for the surplus workers, I'm using air quotes, surplus workers from one country to go and work in another. And it's, if we think of an integrated labor market within a country, it's basically the same principle, but applied across international boundaries. I hope that clarifies the viewer's question.
Okay, thank you for your responses. Another question from Sagar Gautam from actually Nepal. Let me read the question. What are some good policy moves taken for best remittances mobilization in least developing countries? Any comment?
So there are a few things. So I'm not a remittance expert, and the World Bank actually produces this excellent report series called the Migration Remittances Brief that comes out twice a year, and they typically have sections dedicated to remittance flows and best practice around this. But I think a few major principles come to mind. One is having the appropriate incentive structure to use formal channels. So, and this comes back to the cost of remitting. So if there are high fees associated with using formal channels, then that typically discourages remittances through formal channels, and then it goes through various informal means. And in South Asia, historically there have been markets and mechanisms for this. So that's one. Being conscious of sort of the costs of remittances, and I think in many South Asian countries there have been substantial improvements in the cost of remittance. The second has to do with sort of providing financial instruments whereby migrants can be incentivized to invest using these financial instruments. This could be savings accounts and so on and so forth. And so once again, there's an incentive to use the instrument because there might be interest-bearing accounts and whatnot. And the third has to do with financial literacy. So in many cases from South Asia, in South Asian economic migrants are a wide variety. In some cases, as I mentioned, from they could be skilled caregivers, nurses, elder care, child care experts, but they could also be construction workers, agricultural workers, where there are differences in their educational attainment and in the types of training that they might have, and that includes their financial literacy. So, there are some good practices, I think, from even from within the region, in order to make migration safer and more productive, as part of an information intervention, to provide financial literacy training. So once migrants know that, well, this is your income, you can separate out this proportion of your remittances for savings, this portion for consumption, this proportion for education expenses, and so on and so forth, that automatically leads to an awareness of the importance of banking and the importance of savings. And if we think of in South Asia, there's this large NGO called BRAC. They have a large migration program as well. So BRAC is well known for its graduation programming and its microfinance as well. But they also provide services to migrants, all the way from training, providing skills development, all the way to like placement in different countries and providing financial products to help finance that migration. One of their interventions actually includes financial literacy training. So I think this combination of instruments might help improve remittance flows through formal channels.
Thank you very much. Amel, you responded to all the questions that we received in an effective manner. So any final word, final remarks from you before wrapping up the seminar? Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you and the viewers for your patience, especially with some of the technical issues. But I'd just like to note that international migration I mean, it's a very broad topic, as I tried to preface, and I think as some of the viewers' questions noted, there's often conflation between refugee issues, forced displacement, permanent immigration, temporary economic migration, and I think when we have discussions about the costs of these different types of movements, the benefits in some cases to the sending country, the host country, we sort of have to like keep these different things in mind, and especially when we think about forced displacement issues, which is a tragedy, and different countries have international obligations to support. Depending on the convention they signed, they have obligations to support refugees and prevent forced displacement. There's economic migration, which is through formal channels, which is a consensual, agreed upon economic instrument, basically. And so how we make the most of these sort of depends on what type of flow we're talking about. And I'll just like stop on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With us connecting from Washington, we had a pleasure of having Amel Ahmed, who is the senior economist for South Asia in the social protection jobs global practice, who is the co-author of the latest report toward safer and more productive migration for South Asia. Amel, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Very much. Have a good morning.
Great, thank you. We have 2 morning seminars coming up next week. Let me introduce briefly. Tuesday, October 25th, 8 o'clock in the morning, we are going to feature the Latin America and the Caribbean's regional economic update. We are going to have Bill Maloney, who is the chief economist for the region, presenting the main point of the report. And the Wednesday, 26th October, 8 o'clock in Japan Standard Time, we are going to feature the new report, State of the Global Learning Poverty 2022 Update. The featured speaker would be Jose Rogers, who is a lead economist in the Education Global Practice, who is actually the co-author, co-director of the World Development Report 2018 Education. Some of you are already familiar with him as he came to Tokyo to present the report, but we're going to have Jose presenting the latest edition of the State of the Global Learning Poverty report. With that, I'd like to once again thank you everyone for watching the seminar. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next week. Have a nice weekend. Thank you very much.